without any further ado, our first guest of the evening is already on the line joining us. Been waiting to set this one up for a little while. Reporter, journalist Mike Russell with RealFightStories.com. Mike, how are we doing this evening, brother?
I'm doing great, man. How are you guys doing?
I'm excellent. Brad, Mike, Brad, because me and Mike talk all the time.
Mike, what's happening, man? It's a pleasure meeting you tonight on a great Sunday night. I'm sure you got a lot of stuff to talk about, so we'll just give you the platform. Go ahead, man.
Sounds great. What do you guys want to talk about?
I mean, dude. I mean, I guess the big thing is you've been spearheading this whole thing with the patient of Tim Hegg, and it's almost like you're spinning tires at this point in time. Like the fact that we don't have a legitimate report, investigation, breakdown of the whole thing, and we're sitting here, getting closer to that 2-3 month mark. Kind of insulting to the guy's family, is it not?
Yeah, I've been in contact with Tim's family actually quite a bit throughout this whole situation, and the problem is that the city of Edmonton still haven't picked an investigator. So the big problem to me is, any other form of business, if there's a death and it's related to the governing body, no matter if it's a building permit or a licensing issue with a car license, they usually shut down production until they figure out with the investigation. So my problem, I think, is what I think it is basically they've got UFC 215 coming there in September. And from what I've heard from people, even closely linked to the commission, is that they're trying to sweep this all under the rug so that they can put that event on without a hitch. So, the fact that we've got a dead person, this is Tim Hegg had a son. He's got a sister, he's got a brother, he's got his parents. He was loved by a lot of people. And the fact that the city of Edmonton's putting basically money over a human life and over a citizen is, it's concerning to a lot of people. But again, I've called the city numerous times. I've called the police in Edmonton numerous times. And it just seems like they're not doing anything. And, I talked to a mainstream media guy from Edmonton, and he said that the reason why he thinks that they're not really doing much is because they treat sports differently. Like it's a high-risk behavior, like almost like buyer beware what you're doing as you go in. But, as I pointed out in my report that came out a few weeks ago, Tim Hegg never ever should have been licensed to fight in Edmonton. So that's, to me, the investigation should just stop there, because everything that happened after that shouldn't really be of issue, because it was like, you give a kid who is not supposed to be driving a driver's license and he goes out and dies in a car crash. You're not going to blame him. You're not going to blame, the parents. You're not going to blame all these different people if he was legally given a license to do it.
Yeah, but like you said, he should have been given a license. The fact that he had sustained several concussions, knockouts, over the last 6 months prior to that fight, is just it just boggles my mind, man. It's yes, I know sports are handled differently, and it doesn't matter where in the world you go, regardless if we're talking Edmonton, United States, Brazil, Australia, whatever. There's always going to be people who are going to try to find loopholes to try to make things happen. That's just a given. This is part of organized sports that we've kind of dealt with over the years. Is it right? I don't. In my eyes, absolutely not. The fact that you're sitting there saying that Edmonton is basically trying to shove it up under the rug, like there's nothing to see here, nothing happened. UFC's coming to town. We need to make sure this happens. It's just the fact that the UFC knows something like that is going on and still going to Edmonton, to Canada, just tells me everything I need to know about that aspect of the situation.
Yeah. And here's the thing, you're an athlete that's coming into Edmonton knowing that the promotion that you work for, or I guess, are contracted to, is not, doesn't care about your safety, doesn't care. I know they keep saying the UFC is the ones that bring in their own commission and they've got their own doctors and they're pretty confident they can run things. Doesn't matter how well they run things, because the way that the bylaws are worded in Edmonton is that the Edmonton Combative Sports Commission and Pat Reed, the executive director, get final say in everything. So, let's say you go in and you're treated poorly, like Cody McKenzie was, a couple years ago, which is why I started digging in on Edmonton, was that I saw how he was being mistreated and they were breaking laws to suspend him. Let's say you get brought in and you lose a fight because it was just a really crappy decision. They don't even have a protest system in place anymore in Edmonton because Pat Reed removed it because he said that his officials are always right. So you always have to side with the officials. Well, I asked him what happens when they're wrong, and he told me, well, technically we always have to side with our officials because it's a bad look basically if we don't. So, there's a lot more, I think, to the situation to look at. There's one big major aspect of it is that there's history between this executive director and this promoter. So the promoter's this guy named Milan Lubovic. And a few years ago, there were a bunch of officials that put in a complaint saying that Pat Reed had been basically coerced into letting this man pick all of the officials for his bouts. So this guy's a trainer, and he's a manager, and he's a promoter. So he's kind of got the Ali Abdelaziz thing going, in Edmonton right now, where he's, maybe finding some fighters and some officials that might help out his fighters. And, there have been some situations where the actual the referee that was in the Hague fight, he's been known to kind of let fights go long, especially in boxing. He was the one that did a few years ago. There was a fight between Sheila Bird and Kim Couture, and he let Kim Couture basically get choked unconscious for about 5 extra seconds. So, there's kind of a history of this. So this was an official that if I were a boxing manager or a boxing trainer and my fighter was a slow starter, I'd ask for this guy, because he'd let my fighter fight out of some of these situations. So there was that. There was a lawsuit that they actually put in against Pat Reed that they won. So there's this kind of fear, I think, of him saying no to this promoter. And the other thing is, interestingly, I've got an email from 2009 when he started as executive director, Pat Reed, and it was to him, it was basically an official that had experience telling him that this is called a switcheroo. What happens is, in Edmonton especially, because it says in their bylaws, if there isn't a certain amount of rounds scheduled for a boxing event, then they cancel the whole event. So a week out, they had no opponent for Adam Braidwood, and 2 weeks out, or 10 days or something like that, and then all of a sudden Tim Hague is foisted into this position where he's a main event fight. And the way the boxing purists kind of explain it, and boxing, commissions go through a process of deciding whether or not a boxer is ready. And one of the processes, and it's kind of an unknown thing if you're kind of new to boxing or if you're not sure of how the regulation works, you got kind of get your toe put in the water a little bit, so to speak. So you go like maybe a 3-round or 5-round fight. You kind of work your way up from there. So Tim Hague was fighting 3 or 4-round fights, or 5-round at the very most fights, and then he got put in a situation where he's fighting against a guy that's a 12-round fighter who had just won a championship, So I don't know if you guys saw it, but if you look at the ABC commission meeting, or the ABC meetings that they had a few weeks ago, Kirik from mixedmartialarts.com, who actually runs the MMA database that Pat Reed didn't submit some of his results to, kind of broke down the way that California has got this new formula that they're using that you can it's called the severity index. So there's an MMA one and a boxing one that's been used for years, but they're using it kind of more with MMA fighters. Well, they found out that I guess it was Tim Hague was a +6 on this severity index, indicating that he probably shouldn't have been licensed. And Adam Braidwood was a -1 on the severity index, meaning that he was such a heavy favorite. There was like a 7-point spread in between the two of them, which was just, it basically just pointed out that there was a clear mismatch.
Well, and that's the thing that gets me, because you see it here in the States all the time. Even here in PA, in New Jersey, you see the athletic commission be like, you know what, you have X amount of amateur and professional experience. This guy has X amount of amateur and professional experience, but this guy kind of has just a bit more, and we're not okay with this matchup at the time, so we're gonna cancel this fight, and you're gonna have to find another opponent. But
yeah,
this is happening here, and PA isn't an easy state. Neither is New Jersey. But if we're seeing that here, why is it in other parts of the world that we're not starting to see some of these things that happen? Is it because of the athletic commissioner just basically, thinking that he has free reign doing whatever he wants, or is it just, fill in the blanks for me, man. I'm lost. I like, for me,
Sure.
It's a common thing to see if, a guy was knocked out multiple times coming into it that maybe he's going to have to wait an additional, 4 to 6 weeks or even a month, where you're not seeing in other places.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think the key, and all the neurologists that I've spoken to, all of the regulators that I've spoken to, they all say the same thing, is that the key is you have to have some uniformity across all different commissions. So right now in Canada, there's actually a committee that's being set up kind of to do what the ABC does in the States. And I think, your question about why is this not happening, in other places, like in the States, it's actually part of the Ali Act for boxing. So even though there isn't an Ali Act for MMA right now, they're still following a lot of the rules because the commissioners do both. So, there's in the Ali Act and in the boxing rules and in the laws, it actually says that they have to submit all of the results within a certain amount of time. And, there's a lot to it that I think is regulated by the government. So here we don't have that. We don't have it in Canada. So everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and there's little variations to the rules no matter where you look. Like in Montreal, for instance, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there were issues with foot stomps where they wouldn't allow foot stomps because they thought they were so dangerous. And it was like foot stomps of all things, like on the foot. I'm not talking like foot stomps on the head. I'm talking stomping on each other's feet. So there are all these different rules where then the UFC runs into problems because when they try to go into different markets, these rules aren't being used. So I think right now that's the goal would be to get a uniform rule set. But I'm kind of pushing, and I'm talking to a lot of regulators right now about maybe getting some of these rules kind of grandfathered in because of what happened to Tim. So, he had a few non-sanctioned fights. And a lot of locales, because non-sanctioned fights are basically like you don't know what kind of medical care they got and you don't know, exactly what kind of damage they took because this isn't a regulated commission that they're fighting under. They're not an ABC commission. We have ABC commissions in Canada that are under the ABC, but they're like associate members, so it's volunteer almost if you follow the rules, but if you follow them, you have to make sure that you're doing them to a T. So, all of these different places that fighters go, like in Russia, for instance. If you fight over there, a lot of locations here will give you either a 90-day suspension or a 90-day suspension plus before you come back, you have to have a new brain scan and you have to have all new meds done because you never know. If there's no medicals done over there and you catch a communicable, bloodborne disease or something, then you've got nobody to blame, but it shouldn't be foisted upon the next person that you have to fight if you haven't been tested properly. So, to me and to you, it probably seems like common sense that I explain it like to people that aren't MMA people that it's like a Carfax report. So the ABC database combined with their boxing database kind of gives you if you've never seen one of these fighters that's coming into your jurisdiction, that's kind of your first step is you read the Carfax report on them. So the Fight Facts report tells all of the mileage, I like to say, that you took, like the fight time in the ring, and it also shows all the damage that you took. So if you had a knockout and a suspension, it's on that report. So, if you're getting a fighter who has an incomplete Fight Facts report, then what are you going to do? You go to buy a car, you're not going to just say, well, I believe you, everything's great, even though there's some history missing. You bring it to a mechanic and have him hook it up to some machines and test it for you. So I think that's a step in the right direction would be like a Tim Hag rule set as far as non-sanctioned fights go and as far as the suspensions go.
Now, another thing you brought up to me is these non-sanctioned fights are still a thing, apparently. Even though the sport's 20-odd years old now, and it's sanctioned across the United States and whatever. But yeah, there's some states where there's some aspects where you still have it. We had it last year with a women's fighter. What was it? Elizabeth Phillips. She was knocked out in Invicta, out cold, given a 60-day suspension. 30 days later, she's fighting on an Indian reservation. Yeah. I guess the question I'm posing to you is if you're still going to be allowing fighters to do this, I think there should be some type of sanctioning body, athletic commission, someone to say, okay, you were under suspension, you took a fight, let's fine you $30K, and you can't apply for another license for another 8-9 months. Something has to be done as a deterrent, or else these fighters are going to continue to keep doing that. luckily, Elizabeth Phillips, that next fight, she didn't, she was a favorable matchup, and she got the unanimous decision victory. Doesn't count on her record, non-sanctioned fight, but at the same time, we could have been rehashing another situation when we're talking about now with Haig, where she could have gotten knocked out again, and it could have been even worse.
Yeah, and I agree.
Hey, Mike.
Sure.
Let me ask you a quick question. When they sign these contracts to fight, and I don't know if Tim, did he sign a contract at all to fight for this non-sanctioned bout? Okay, well, in the wording,
I think he probably did. The ones in Russia that he had, two fights in Russia. I'm pretty sure they were contracted, but one of the contracts that he had that was binding, the reason why he fought his second last fight that he just fought that was called a super boxing fight with MMA gloves and no ground was to get around his contract that he had in Russia that was for one of these non-sanctioned promotions that he was fighting for. So, I know there are a bunch of, some of them say, well, we do all this stuff for meds and everything else. Well, if you're not an organization that's using a commission that is reputable, there's actually a clip if you guys want to go and have a look at it. It was Tim's second last non-sanctioned bout. So it was one in Russia in 2015 that kind of started this downward spiral of knockouts and issues that I think he had. And one of the big problems was that there was no medical staff on duty. I'm told by somebody that was speaking to one of his corners, which I have an interview scheduled with one of the corners at the event, and he said that basically Tim got knocked out, and if you watch on video, the referee pulls a smelling salt packet out of his pocket and revives Tim, and him and an assistant that was standing at ringside get him up and walk him to the back. So, every neurologist I've spoken to has said that is totally against knockout protocol. First of all, you're not supposed to.
Well, shouldn't they stabilize the head? Shouldn't they be stabilizing the head, especially if he had head trauma? Yeah, put him on 100%. A backboarder.
Supposed to have a doctor come in and check his eyes to make sure that everything's okay, and there's a lot that basically was never done. And then I'm told that they basically they sent him to the back to recover, and there was nobody there to check him even out back. And then the next day he's back on a plane from Russia to Edmonton, which is one of the worst things you can do if you possibly have a brain bleed. So, you look at stuff like that, and these horror stories of guys. Sorry, go ahead.
It's frustrating, Mike. It's frustrating to me because, like Steve says, it's been 20 years. But 20 years should be enough time where we can make the sport safer. I mean, they're trying to do that everywhere. They're trying to do it in the NFL. They're trying to do it in MMA. But in this certain area, this is going to be a black eye for MMA. And if we're ever to take it seriously and to put it above the NFL and to make it the supreme sport that it, aims to be, this shit can't be swept under the rug.
No, and that's the thing. And here, you're like me. I've been kind of equating this to MMA because Tim's an MMA fighter. This is actually like a boxing issue when you look at it, the fact that he had a boxing fight, which never should have been foisted on boxing because 90% of Tim's fights were MMA fights. And, a lot of the damage that he took was under the Edmonton Athletic Commission when he should have been off. And there's a lot of people I think that are going to be unduly blamed for a lot of these things happening. The sport in general, nobody likes to see this happen.
I think, Mike, now with boxing, it's all like put into combat sports now. Everything, in general, combat sports is going to have that black eye. How the hell can you sweep this under the rug? It's impossible. There's no way you can sweep this under the rug. A man died. If you're working as a police officer or firefighter, if a man dies on the job, in the line of duty, they do all this sort of training to retrain the guys and girls to be better and to look out for those kinds of situations. To me, something needed to be done to be fixed. But there is no solution right now. It doesn't look like even close to being a solution.
I think one of the biggest problems, especially with, you look at organizations like the ABC, I think the ABC is giving false hope. When I started a couple years ago looking into Edmonton, and if you look through my website, I've been complaining about these safety issues, like for 2 years, I think, 2.5 years. So when I first started complaining, and I was running out of people to complain to because Edmonton didn't want to hear it, their commission didn't want to hear it, I go to the ABC, and they basically don't do anything. I brought proof to them that even the Edmonton Commission had lied to them in a disciplinary hearing, and they did nothing about it. And then the more people I talk to that are even in the ABC tell me, yeah, it's because it's a volunteer organization. They don't want to tick everybody off because it's a paid membership. So, it's like buyer beware. It's the same issue with Edmonton not wanting to tick off promoters by canceling fights. It's because they were on a cost recovery basis. And if you're losing money, you're not going to be around that much longer. So there's kind of a push-pull with ABC, and they've got another group that was started by the ex-president of the ABC. So, when I'm asking why can't you suspend and why can't you sanction all of these parties that are offending or making these multiple safety offenses, and members are telling me because they won't. And it's like they can't. So here's the thing. ABC is great if there's somebody that's actually looking into things and there's some oversight, but there isn't. So I would like to see government oversight here in Canada where they hire somebody federally. And, I don't know if that'll happen, but I think it needs to, especially when we're going to have, the problem in Edmonton was they were one of the only last remaining city commissions. Everywhere else is, we've got provinces and not states here in Canada. Everyone else is provincially run and they've got government oversight. So, if there was something like this that happened at a provincial level, they probably would have got the commission shut down immediately and there wouldn't have been any argument. But Edmonton doesn't want to lose. Remember a few years ago they gave the number at about $1 million worth of revenue that the UFC brings to town. The Edmonton is starved not only for cash, like as far as businesses go. They haven't had an event, a big-time event like this since the WEC came in it was WEC 49. But problem is, the UFC said they were never coming back to Edmonton as long as Pat Reed was in power, and I've heard this from multiple sources, because they had such safety issues then. They had to tell the doctors to go in the ring after guys were knocked out because they were such untrained doctors, because the UFC wanted like 5 doctors, 6 doctors, and they only had 1 or 2. So they brought untrained doctors in, put them ringside, and they didn't know enough to go in the cage to take care of fighters that were knocked out. So,
that's absurd. That's absurd. Yeah. I mean, you can find a dozen decent doctors. They're out there. I mean, how the hell can a doctor not know to go check somebody out and just do the normal eye check, ear check, smile, certain things like that? It just seems like it's lazy to me. Seems lazy.
Well,
to me.
And here's the thing: Mark Ratner was dead set against coming back, because Mark Ratner is about safety for fighters, 100%. He's always been that way. He was the one that brought it up to Pat Reed that his doctors needed to go in the ring. He was apparently pretty irate by judging by people that were there and witnessed it and that relayed the story to me. And he asked Pat Reed why the doctors weren't going in, and Reed's answer was, well, I figured they were doctors, they should know. So,
they can mind read.
And that's the thing. Pat Reed is not a combat sports guy. He admitted in an interview that when he was hired, he had never watched a full MMA event. So what it was he was hired by the city for another position that kind of ended because it was like a bid for one of these games bids, and they wanted to keep him. So they kept him by getting rid of the old executive director who was part-time and making this position. So they created a job for a guy that was so inept that even in the job interview, when they were doing all the interviews of all the candidates, all of the people on the commission who were at the time were only in this for the betterment of the sport, said they didn't believe that he was the man for the job because it would be a disaster waiting to happen if you put a guy with no combat sports experience in. So, you look through all the things he's done. He let Sokaju fight Ryan Jimmo, who Ryan Jimmo was a local guy at the time living in Edmonton, so he wasn't doing him any favors. Let Sokaju take home his MFC gloves for a championship bout the night before back to the hotel to stretch them out, and they came back. He actually cut pieces of the gloves out, and he was allowed to use them. So right in the bylaw in Edmonton, it says brand new gloves in the bag have to be applied to a fighter's hand. So it was Pat Reed that actually let him leave, and when he was stopped leaving, there were other officials that said, no, that's against the rules in the bylaw. He said, yeah, we're going to let it happen, and he let the guy leave. There's another instance where I talked to a fighter named George Belanger, and George tells me that there was one of the blood components that was necessary in Edmonton at the time was syphilis. And I've done some research, and apparently there was a major outbreak of syphilis in Edmonton and Alberta in the 90s and 2000s, so they kept it on the books. And when this guy didn't have the test done, they told George Belanger, even though it was in the rules and in the bylaws, he said, Pat Reed came up to him and said, I know we canceled your fight. It was backstage right before the main event. Well, the promoter came to him and told him he didn't want him to cancel the fight. He came and offered to let this guy without the blood test fight anyway. So, to me, there's a pattern here, and I think that it all kind of goes back to this one individual that's making all the decisions that are, unsafe and stuff that we'd look at and say, oh, my God, I can't believe this is happening. Tampered gloves will get you jail time, and it has before in boxing.
Yeah, the bottom line is guy's a cheater.
Go ahead, Brad. Go ahead.
Guy's a cheater. Or
yeah.
You can't play dumb forever saying you don't know the rules.
No, he's been there since 2009. So we're talking, 9 years or 8 years now he's been there.
Yeah.
So 8 years, you figure when you started following the sport, 8 years in, I've been writing about the sport since 2006 and, 11 years in, and I have a pretty good handle on the sport. I can't imagine and I haven't done this full-time for, I think I had about 2 years where I was full-time as an MMA reporter. And, he's been at this 40 hours a week for, 8-9 years, and he's letting stuff like this go. And the reason being, he doesn't really care for the sport. It's one of those things where I think it was just a for-now job. If you look even on his LinkedIn now, he says that he's looking at retiring and getting into teaching university or college, and that's because the city paid for him to go back to university and get his PhD in an totally unrelated thing. So, this was just a cash cow for Pat Reed that was a convenient, way to go and to make some money and to be in charge. And you know what? He kind of cut a lot of really good people out of the commission that were really, I've talked to probably a dozen officials, and these are like WBC judges that have judged world title fights that were cut out of Edmonton because of bringing up a lot of these issues. And they put in complaints about a lot of these issues and said, this is an accident waiting to happen. So part of the problem, I think, now is the city knows that, oh, shit, we probably should have listened to a lot of these people that were, knocking on our door. I emailed for 2 years of phone calls, emails. I even had a tape of an interview I did with Pat Reed, just like this interview, where he admitted to me that he breached the bylaw to suspend Cody McKenzie in that World Series of Fighting fight. So I brought that to the city, and I had a trackable link. Not one person from the city who told me for sure they were investigating clicked the link, and then they closed the case. So, that's why when everybody says we've got this third-party investigator and we're going to see how it goes, I have very little faith that this is going to be a proper, open investigation. I think it's going to be, manipulated because here's the thing. The investigation can only do one of two things. It's going to show who was responsible, if anybody, or if it was just a freak accident. And already by my report, we've already proven that there is some liability, I think, in my eyes, that there were some people responsible that didn't do their job. And, you guys talk about how fighters are going to get around fighting, and they're going to, fighters, they will fight anybody anywhere, most fighters, but the last line of defense before you get in that cage is the regulator. So the athletic commission are the ones that are supposed to say, no, have a seat over there, you're not ready, no, we're not regulating this, no. And they didn't. And, they didn't on like 6 or 7 different occasions with Tim where he was allowed to fight. So I think, everything else is just, you're just looking at, there's red herrings everywhere that they're trying to throw out, because I've heard that they're trying to blame the doctors. I heard that Pat Reed has got a tape of Tim Hagg sparring. More than one person has told me that there's a tape out there of Tim sparring and he got knocked out in sparring, and that's what they're trying to blame all of this on. Well, even if he was and he did go around that still does not excuse the fact that you illegally licensed him on more than one occasion.
Yeah, when you go back to the other thing you're saying, like how, Ratner said they would never go back to Edmonton as long as Reed was there. We've all seen the same thing here in PA. We've seen, obviously the last time they were in Pittsburgh, you had Brian Stan all over social media basically burying the athletic director like there was no tomorrow. And, I still think it's a big reason why they, since UFC 133, why they haven't been back here to Philadelphia. And if you have a commissioner like that is causing issues, and, and let's go back even further than, like, stuff you're talking about that goes even further back than, from when he first started. Like, Forrest Griffin was knocked out 3 different times in training camp for the 101 bout that he had with Anderson Silva. And everyone was wondering, Forrest is going to be the guy to finally be able to push him. This was long before the Chris Weidman fights and all that, and that Anderson wound up knocking him out with a jab, and everyone was like, the fight was fixed. Forrest threw the fight.
Yeah.
I wonder how much they paid him to stand the
determined
third.
by how much head trauma he took. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, we know that pre-existing head injuries are known to, put fighters in danger regardless of how tough they are or how much we know they can take. Like, listen, as you said, the sanctioning body should be the last line, saying, no, you're in great physical shape. I don't like this aspect of it. But we've also seen situations where they come out and do the right thing. Oh, there was something they couldn't figure out what was what on an MRI scan of their brain. They automatically ripped the guy off the card.